पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौ शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तरं दिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौ शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra Sukhinas Santu. Sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Shanti 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 Harihi Om.
We will sing Let Us Go Back to Our Own Abode on the last page in your book.
Let us go back to
Asato ma satkamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritam gamaya, aviravirmayeti, rudrayatte dakshinam mukham, tenamam pahi nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. With the Divine consciousness, fill our hearts and protect us. The song that we had just now was the very first song Swami Vivekananda, the young man at Narendranath, sang before Sri Ramakrishna, and he went into Samadhi. It's a beautiful song. The English version that we did here is as beautiful as the original in Bengali. So much to reflect on in that song. And it's very closely connected with this morning's theme on greed. In the next few minutes, we'll try to reflect on what greed means, what it can do, how to overcome it, and why it is important to overcome greed. Now, it's difficult to define exactly what greed is, but all of us know what it means. In general, it's possible to say that greed is the desire to possess anything beyond what is necessary. Now, what is necessary and what is not necessary are very subjective things. And so, the definition of necessary will vary from person to person. What is seen, therefore, as greed by one person may not be seen as greed by another person. And therefore, every one of us has to decide for ourselves what greed means. Specifically, as I said, it's very difficult to define greed objectively beyond very general terms. So subjectively, we have to look in our own lives and see whether there is any greed. And the way to do that is to see what I consider are the necessary things for me, and if my mind hankers for what is more than what I perceive as necessary. So it's helpful to begin by seeing how greed is viewed in general. Now, in a secular setting, greed is not generally seen as a negative trait, by and large. In fact, many believe that greed should be embraced wholeheartedly as it is essential in human affairs. In fact, according to some, greed is necessary for the capitalist system to thrive. Now, others object to this view, saying that greed is not essential in a capitalistic society. And rather than using the word greed, the phrase that often gets used is enlightened self-interest. So there is self-interest involved, but can we elevate that self-interest to a higher level? And so the phrase, at least 20 or 30 years ago, the phrase enlightened self-interest was much in vogue. I don't know how much in vogue it is today. So the idea is that it's okay to look after one's own self-interest so long as it does not come at the expense of another. Can I satisfy my greed without depriving someone else of their need? In other words, can I find a win-win situation in which I can pursue my self-interest without hurting anyone else's interest? Again, there is no easy answer to this question. Swami Vivekananda said, "We cannot breathe or live without injuring others, and every morsel of food we eat is taken from another's mouth. Our very lives are crowding out some other lives. It may be those of men or animals or small fungi, but someone, somewhere, we have to crowd out." Now that's really, if you take a much longer range view of existence itself, there is really no win-win situation in that sense. If we look at the whole food chain, it just makes sense that what is food for one is, well, if the food, for the food, it's destruction. Something is getting destroyed in the process. So in any way, if you see in larger terms, we are able to see what is meant, that everything I consume beyond my need is someone is getting deprived somewhere. And it may not be very apparent, it may not be very clear, that connection, but that seems to be, that every time there is a rise somewhere, there is a fall somewhere else. Now this seems to be inbuilt in the nature of existence. And so it brings us back to the original question. What is it that I really need? And the answer depends on how I understand the meaning and purpose of life. And because our understanding of the meaning and purpose of life is different people have different ways of understanding life. So their definition of what is needed or what is necessary will also vary according to that. Now, in a religious setting, greed has always been seen, looked at very negatively. In early Christian teachings, greed was included in the list of 7 deadly sins, a list meant to teach followers about the natural tendencies inherited through the fall from grace. Now, nowhere in the Bible is there a specific list of such sins, although there are lists of virtues contrasted with the list of sins, as we find in the epistle to the Galatians, for instance. The modern concept of the 7 deadly sins is linked to the works of the 4th century monk Evagrius Ponticus, who listed 8 evil thoughts. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory revised the list to form the more common 7 deadly sins. So we can trace it back as far back as the 6th century. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that greed was a sin against God, just as all mortal sins, inasmuch as a man condemns things eternal for the sake of temporal things. Greed was also seen as a form of idolatry, as the greedy person values money, possessions, etc., more than God. For most people, God is a means, not an end, a means to attaining wealth and possessions. So in some sense, when we pray to God for these things, although that's not how we think consciously, but in some ways, when we pray to God for anything other than God, then it's a subtle way of admitting that those things are more important. And God then becomes only a means of me attaining those other things. And in such cases and such way of doing, dollar worship takes precedence over the worship of God. And therefore, wealth itself becomes an idol. Now, since everything is gathered for the pleasure of the person, it's also possible to see that the greedy person himself or herself becomes one's own God, because everything is for the pleasure of this one being. And therefore, that creates pride and bolstering of one's ego. So there are all these ways Christianity has seen the evil of greed. And this is not specific to Christianity itself. Similar echoes we find in other traditions as well. If we look up the Quran or the religious scripture of the Sikhs, Buddha's teachings, everywhere you find similar ideas about greed and warning people to stay away from the weakness of greed. In Vedanta, greed is seen primarily as a result of a sense of incompleteness. We feel that there is something lacking within us. And often we are not even sure what it is that is lacking. And it's that feeling of emptiness in our heart. It's some kind of a vacuum. And then we try to fill that vacuum. And sometimes we feel the more I fill it with food, wealth, recognition, possessions, some of that emptiness within will vanish. There is a quote often attributed to Houston Smith, and he used to say that every person has a God-shaped hole in their heart. And we try to fill that hole with so many different things, and nothing really fits. Because if it's a God-shaped hole, only God can fill that hole. That was a very nice way of expressing that that deeper sense of emptiness that we feel. Nothing else, no amount of accumulating, consuming of anything other than that highest ideal will bring that emptiness to an end. That is not to say that acquiring many of these things that people seek in life don't bring some amount of fulfillment. They do. They do bring joy. They do bring happiness. But it's never really full. It's always temporary. It fulfills a partial need, but we never seem to reach a point when we can say, I don't, and people say that. You have seen people say, I don't need anything. They don't really mean it. There is a phrase in Sanskrit called kritakritya. Kritakritya means, in the literal sense of the term, it means that I have done whatever needs to be done. And if that is true, then one will not be looking forward to anything or doing anything, because whatever needs to be done has already been done. But that hasn't happened yet. We always look forward to things. In other words, there are things that need to be accomplished. There are things that need to be done. So things that people want, or if you want to use the word greed, the things that people are greedy for, if we just want to reduce them to some manageable number of categories, in ancient texts, they have brought it down to 4 things in life. This is with the idea that no matter what we think we want, what we really want, whether or not we express it in those words, is we want to be happy. We don't want any pain and suffering in life. We want to be happy. Again, we might express this in different ways, but that's the bottom line. That's where all sane people agree. I mean, it's very difficult to find any person saying, I want to be miserable. So that's, I think, pretty much universal, that we want to be happy, we don't want to suffer. Where we do differ is, what is it that will make me happy? What is it that will remove pain and suffering from my life? That is where we have many different ideas. And so in that, looking at it in that way, some ancient thinkers in the Vedantic tradition have reduced the wants of human beings to 4 categories. And sometimes they just call them by the word Purushartha. Purusha is people, and Artha means want. So what do people want? Sometimes in some texts, I have seen these 4 Purusharthas being translated as the 4 goals of life. Actually, that's not right. The goal, if you want to use the word goal, the goal is simply to be happy. And these are the 4 things, the 4 options we can reduce what we want to, about what people think that will make them happy. So first is wealth. We have already said a little bit about that. And that makes sense because we know what kind of things make us happy. And in order to acquire those things, in order to get those things, wealth is definitely helpful. So wealth as an instrument for getting me things that make me happy itself then becomes something that I strive to get. And so that becomes a value to strive for in life. And that's in Sanskrit, often they use the word artha to refer to wealth and possessions. In other words, simply the means to acquire things that make me happy. Now, some people, therefore, make attaining more wealth as the primary value of their life. They can be greedy for wealth because they believe it will make them happy, it will bring them happiness. Now, there are some other people who believe that wealth can be a means, but what really makes me happy, what is a more direct source of happiness is enjoyment. I mean, even with wealth, I first need to get something with the help of this wealth, things that will make me happy, bring me enjoyment. So they see enjoyment itself as a value. And that word in Sanskrit is called kama. So when everything that I do, everything that I strive for, the goal is to get more enjoyment because I see that as a more direct way of making myself happy. So that's the second purushartha. The third is, there are some people who believe, yes, this is not to discount the value of wealth or enjoyment, but they feel that by themselves, these are not enough. That there has to be life of dharma, life of honesty, truthfulness, life holding some of these basic principles of life. That bereft of these principles, merely wealth and enjoyment cannot make me happy. And that's why then dharma, living honestly, living truthfully, living selflessly, becomes a value. And the fourth one was, while all of these things are okay, what can make me happy is freedom. That while I can experience happiness to a limited degree, while being bound within certain limitations, being controlled by certain laws, by a very benevolent overlord. It's possible to see even God, the popular way people generally understand God, is pretty dictatorial. There is no democracy there. You don't elect God. But God is seen as someone who is loving, kind of a very benevolent dictator, a dictator who always loves. The ideal of moksha is, well, it's good to have a benevolent dictator, but it will be even better to not have anybody above us, not even God. And so that would be then a freedom, that not being bound even under any kind of laws, even if there are divine laws, no laws. And so that's the extreme position of saying, well, that's the thing that will bring me really happy. And therefore moksha, or freedom from anything external, anything apart from my own true self, is seen as a bondage. So then these four things. So people have been then greedy for one or the other of these. Greedy for wealth, or greedy for enjoyment, or greedy for living an honest life, or greedy for freedom. And again, everyone has to make their own choice. It's not always a very watertight distinction. It's not like if I'm greedy for one, I cannot be greedy for the other. And therefore, we might find that in our lives, we're probably greedy for all these four. But the extent of our greed for them might be different. Again, this is something that we all have to look inside our own heart to see where this kind of categorization, how it fits in our own life and our own understanding of life. The effects of greed are easy to understand, both intellectually as also from our own experience in life. First is clearly restlessness. The more I'm greedy for something, we cannot be at rest, cannot be at peace, so long as I don't
have in my possession whatever it is that I am greedy for. And so things that I long for and I yet don't have, people can lose their sleep over it, and it can also affect the quality of my work. Because if while I'm doing some work, if my full attention is not on that work, but my mind is thinking, oh, I need that, then the quality of my work is also going to suffer. And so first, obvious effect of the presence of greed in our lives is it makes us restless. The more the greed, greater the restlessness. And then an obvious next thing would be a lack of peace. Because even when we get whatever it is that we are greedy for, we still cannot be at rest, because usually greed begets more greed. If I want something and if I get it and I'm satisfied, I should consider myself lucky. But usually, if I get what I want and if it makes me happy, I want more of it. If 1 cup of coffee makes me happy, well, 2 cups might make me more happy. 3 cups might make me even more happy, and 4 cups might make me drowsy. It's not a very straight curve. And that's true not just with coffee. It's true with everything in life. And that's why the virtue of moderation, of self-restraint, everything has a value. But if I understand what that value is and keep it at that level, I can truly enjoy life. But once I'm not able to keep the proportion, I'm not able to, well, let me put it this way, that life can be seen as a jigsaw puzzle, that every element of our life is a piece of that puzzle. And if we can put all those pieces in the right place, we have a beautiful picture, and life can be a great joy. But if we put a piece in a wrong place, and then of course the picture is never complete, and then we can never be truly happy. And so that's essentially, no matter what philosophies or the way different philosophies might put it, that essentially is how life is. We just have to see the different pieces of our own lives, and what we are doing consciously or unconsciously is trying to put all these pieces, and with the hope that ultimately, if every piece goes in the right place, a beautiful picture will emerge, and then I can be at peace. And some of the major changes that sometimes occur in our lives disturb that picture. For instance, you move to a new place, or there is a new member in the family, or you take up a new job. So clearly, we begin our life with a few pieces, and then with change of place and work and people and relationships, different pieces come into the picture. And so if a picture is now almost like halfway through, we are working on it, and then some new pieces come, and then I have to figure out where it goes. So that's essentially how life is. And a wise person is one who has figured out exactly which piece goes where. And once the picture is complete, then it's all fine. And so we just have to see at what stage our life is in, that how many pieces have been filled in, how many pieces are still lying scattered, and we need to continue to find the right place for that piece. So greed, as I said, begets more greed, because rarely do people feel enough. As they say, there is a story about one homeless person. He goes and there's a stand before the home of a millionaire and asks for some help. And unfortunately, that person not only doesn't give any help, but but is very, very insulting, very humiliating, just kind of brushes off that person. And that person is so mad, anyone would be mad. And he just tells that millionaire, he says, don't think there is too much difference between you and me. While you are working for your second million, I'm trying for my first million. So there is never really enough. Most of us, we just feel if I get something more, well, I could have something more. And that's the problem. And so wealth and property, when it exceeds our immediate need, it often brings additional stress and anxiety. Food, when it exceeds our immediate need, can bring sickness. We all know sometimes when we are overeaten, when the food is delicious, while we are eating, it's great happiness. But happiness is short-lived. I mean, the passage of food only between this like 6 inches of this thing, that's about how much happiness it is. Once the food goes beyond this, then there is just pain for not only in digesting the food and then with making sure that people are striving to kind of weight loss or weight gain. All these problems come just because of this thing. So again, we just have to see it's how cost effective it is to get more than what we need, any of these things. There is a little bit of joy, a lot of worries afterwards. And so therefore, sooner or later, we realize, or at least we should realize, or we will realize, and that's what maturity means, would be to not make this very facile equation that more possessions automatically implies more happiness. So that connection is not true. It's not as if it won't bring happiness, but to say immediately that more wealth, more possession automatically means more happiness, that's not true. It's also can sometimes happen if we don't use our resources or our assets wisely, that more greed, we might lose what we have. And there is a story we were told as children about a person who had a hen and who laid a golden egg every day. Now that's great, and this person could have been happy with that. But the idea was, well, just one egg every day, just one golden egg? And then he said, well, it might be so nice if I can just kind of investigate and see inside and get a lot more eggs. And of course, that it ended. So there is a possible that sometimes a greed beyond a certain limit, we might not only get what we want, but we might lose what we already have. And finally, greed, and this is very obvious, especially in the times in which we live, is responsible for the destruction of the planet. All of the environmental woes that we are experiencing today, we will see in one way or the other, it boils down to greed. People who are looking for immediate benefit without considering the long-term loss. And it's also selfish, because sometimes we might say, well, I'm going to now benefit by this, but what about my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, the generation that are going to come afterwards? What kind of a planet are we going to leave behind for them? And if we don't consider that, then it's not only the problem of greed, but greed which becomes even worse because of selfishness. So then how do we overcome greed? One way of doing that is through the fear of consequences. We saw, if we look at greed as one of the deadly sins, then of course the fear of hell can keep people, can force people to make an effort not to be greedy. And that may well have been the intention of people who gave a very graphic descriptions of the suffering in hell. And so it cannot be denied that the fear of hell, or fear itself, fear of the consequences, can make people at least try to not be so greedy. But it's also very limited, this way of using fear has a limited scope in some ways. Um, just think about speeding. Why is it that we don't speed? And for most people, it's because, well, if the cop sees me, I will be given a ticket. And so oftentimes you will see when you're going on a highway or something and suddenly you find everyone slowing down, the first thought is, well, there is a cop somewhere in the area. And so there is the fear of being caught, fear of consequences. And so that fear has never been enough. In fact, the deaths caused by of accidents on the road is a very big number. More deaths are caused by that than through all terroristic activities. And so fear has not helped really in minimizing that or curtailing that. And for instance, now if I drive following all the traffic laws, not out of fear of the cops, but recognizing that it is good for my own safety and the safety of other people, the other cars that are being driven or other people or whoever. Now, if that way, if I see it, not out of fear, but recognizing that it is the right thing to do, then there is some hope. And therefore, greed, to try to stifle greed in human beings mere through fear, has got a very limited application. Because oftentimes our desires are so powerful that people brush aside the fear and indulge in sinful behavior anyway. So which later then produces not only the fear of eternal punishment, but also the anxiety of guilt. And so fear, while it's helpful, it's somewhat limited. Another way to deal with greed is through introspection. Now, introspection needs a careful observation of one's own life, of the lives of people around us, and of the past through the study of history, to see that greed has not helped anyone in the past or the present. So if I reflect on what effect greed has had on other people, it might then make me not be greedy. That's why we learn a lot. Probably if we are willing to learn, we learn a lot by just looking around us, looking at the people we work with, the people we live with, the work that we do. It can be so instructive. It's more than what we can find in books, more than what you can hear from your parents or teachers. We may not need any of those things at all. If we learn to, as they say, read the book of life, there is so much we can learn. Just by looking at other people, we know what we should do and what we should not do. And that's why my favorite example about this is Tulsidas, the great saint who wrote a version of the Ramayana. In the very beginning of his work, he begins, the most traditional texts begin with the salutations called Mangala Charana. And so in the beginning, Tulsidas says, I bow down to all the good people of the world and I bow down to all the wicked people of the world. And then someone asked Tulsidas, this doesn't make sense. Of course, bowing down to saints and good people is good. But why are you bowing down and saluting people who are wicked and bad? And then Tulsidas said, they both are my teachers. By looking at good people, I know what I should do, how I should live. By looking at wicked people, I learn how I should not live, what I should not do. So they both are teaching me. And so introspection, therefore, requires looking at life, the world, the people around us, and looking in our own heart and to see what I can learn by looking at them. We see that people who enjoyed real happiness were not greedy people. We see that people who are truly happy in the truest sense of the term were unselfish, were honest, were truthful. And that gives us a clue of what we should do if we want to be like them. So looking at the life around us, people around us, we can take a look at our own lives and see what is it that we already have and what is it that we think we need more. And then ask ourselves a tough question. Every time I feel I need this, I have to ask myself, do I really need this? And if the answer is a very definitive yes, then of course, I should go and get it. But if the answer is, no, I don't really need it, I can do without it, but it'll be good to have it, then we need to really then use a strength and courage to then say, well, if I can do without it, then I better not have it. So that's one of the ways in spiritual life people have tried to do. Because a present consumeristic society is not very helpful in this way, because all advertisements and everything, their primary goal is to make us think your life would be incomplete if you don't buy this, if you don't get this. And it's evolved into a science by itself. And so to fight against, there are some really smart people are behind this campaign of somehow making the product look so attractive, so essential, that we think life would be impossible without it. I think many of us today might think, without a cell phone, how can we just live without a cell phone? But those of us who are old enough know that, well, life was just fine. We were fine without a cell phone, without emails, without Facebook, without Twitter. None of these social media were there. And it wasn't like we were all suffering without that. But again, now that we have gotten used to it, it just seems like, oh, it's impossible to live without it. And so there is a lot, once we start reflecting over it, we lot to see what is it that I really need. About 17 or 18 years ago, I got a chance to visit Tibet and then make a trip to that holy mountain, the Mount Kailash. And that, it's a very high altitude. We trek almost along 15 to 16,000 feet. And at one point, we had to almost go up to 18,000 feet. And so we have to be careful about the altitude sickness, and some of you may have been there as well. So one of the challenges there was, we were told, take minimum things, because you can't carry anything. Thank God there are these yaks, like big, like giant buffalo-like creatures. They carry most of the stuff, and then there are some horses. And so what I had thought was, well, while most of the stuff will be going on this yak back, and that also was still pretty minimum. Everyone, I think we could carry with us, if I remember rightly, probably not more than 10 kilos would be like what? 23 pounds? Yeah, pretty much like, one bag. Actually, it's smaller than that. A kind of a carry-on was all that we could carry. And so what we did was, I thought I'll just carry with me a bottle of water while I'm trekking, because it's a 3-day trek around Kailash, and just some essential medicines if needed. And very soon we discovered even carrying that bottle of water was not possible. And so luckily we had hired 3 porters, 3 Tibetan young men, and they were just running on those places. They had no difficulty. I think it's partly also because when you kind of grow up in that environment, your lungs are ready to deal with that altitude. And those of us, most of us who live at the sea level, you suddenly go there. It has only about 65% of the oxygen that we have here. So you really need to get used to that rare atmosphere. Anyway, I just mentioned this to show that. So we were there for about 3 weeks, and it was amazing. Circumstances forced us to not take anything more than we need, but it was very instructive. At the end of 3 weeks, we found, well, 3 weeks I could live with only something that held in a small little bag. And I survived, and I was happy. And so then you suddenly realize, probably most of the things that we think we need we don't really need. I mean, it's good to have them, but we don't really need them. So that's something that introspection can make us do. And Sri Ramakrishna gave a method which is very helpful for devotees, for spiritual seekers. And he said, just turn the course. By turn the course, he meant that all of these things that we see are hurdles in spiritual life. Can we turn them in a different direction? So, if I am struggling with anger, then that's really a problem. How can I remove, or how can I minimize my temper? And Ramakrishna said, well, besides the other things I might do to deal with my anger, I can use that force, that energy of anger, and turn it in a different direction. So rather than being angry with people or places or work around me, I can be angry at the thought that I haven't yet realized God. I can be angry at the obstacles in my spiritual life. If I must be greedy, rather than being greedy for any of these perishable things which I don't really need, I can be greedy for God. A devotee of God can be greedy for God's vision or for love of God. So greed, if it is to be there with me, I can just change its direction. And if I change its direction, instead of it becoming an obstacle, it can in fact become a great asset in spiritual life. And so that's a very, very practical teaching that many of us might consider of how we can employ it in our own lives. There was a great child saint called Prahlada. You find his story in the Bhagavata and in many books in the Indian mythology and history. And so it's a very fascinating life. If you haven't read it, take a look. So one prayer that is attributed to Prahlada was this. And he said, what kind of love is Prahlada asking or wanting? And so he says, Lord, may I have that love for you that a worldly person has for worldly things. So the intensity with which worldly people seek worldly things, let me seek you, God, with that same intensity. So again, and that's a beautiful way to see it, to appreciate the intensity of a fanatic or the intensity of a worldly person for worldly things, and take that intensity and turn it towards God, turn it toward the spiritual life. So finally, just a few concluding remarks. It's helpful to remember that in any journey, and many of us have traveled smaller or greater distances, and we know from our experience that lesser the luggage, more comfortable the journey. If you don't check in your bag, chances of it being lost are less. The other day, someone was telling me a person wanted to check in 2 bags. And so he goes to the check-in counter and says, I want to check in this bag to Los Angeles. Then the other one, I want to check it to Washington, D.C. And they said, no, you can't do that. If you're checking in, both the bags will go to the same place. And he said, no, it's possible. Last time I traveled, you did that. 2 of my bags. So we know, if you don't check in your bags, there is less chances of pain at the end of the journey. And so therefore, if we see spiritual journey as a long journey, then the less baggage we have, the happier we are. And we see that actually. When we travel by train, we can carry a lot of stuff. When you go by flight, it's still smaller. If you decide to go to the moon or a space flight, which are coming, if you want, you can now go for a few hours. Well, you can carry even fewer things there. And so if we want to go now in this long spiritual journey, it's the farthest in some way. And therefore, the minimum baggage we carry, the happier it will be. Actually, it's not the baggage that's so much a problem. The problem is the sense of ownership. And the ownership is absent, then things themselves don't do harm. And that's something, that's a discussion for another day, but I think that's something to remember as well. That is not, it's not how many things we have, but how many of those things I see as mine. Sri Ramakrishna often said that see yourself as the steward of things that God has entrusted in your care. So if everything that we have, not just the material possessions, but even members of our family, our friends, our family, our possessions, if we see that all of these things belong to God. That's how a devotee will see it. All things belong to God, but God has said, there are so many things. Okay, you take care of these things. And so we should take care of the things that we possess. We should take care of our family. We should take care of our friends. And as devotees, if we remember that none of them belong to me, they are not mine, that they truly belong to God. And because I love God, and because they belong to God, I love them as well. So our love for everyone and everything should come via God. God is the satellite from which everything needs to be bounced. And so that way, once we recognize that God is the real owner, that we are only trustees, we are only there to take care of these things, then if and when we are separated from any of these things that are around us, we will be able to let go of them easily. We will know that they belong to God, and it was in God's will to now take them away from me. Eventually, everything will. We are now old enough, all of us here, to recognize when we came into this world, we came with nothing other than this just body. And when we go, we leave even the body behind, what to speak of any of the other things that we have. And therefore, everything that we see as mine is not really mine. And so if we look at it that way, if we not have that sense of ownership, then it's much, much easier to deal with the problem of greed. So if we have this attitude towards our family, our friends, our possessions, that there'll be greater love, greater care, and greater understanding in our lives. There is much to think about greed in many of these different aspects. So I would encourage you to reflect on what greed means to you, what you think role it's playing, and find ways that best suit your own understanding of how to deal with it. Because we know from experience and from teachings of these great ones that greed can eventually just lead to only pain and suffering. So if we want to be happy, we have to find innovative ways of eliminating greed from our lives. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu. Next Sunday, we have a guest speaker, Jacob Meskin, who is a senior lecturer at the Hebrew College in Newton. He will speak on discovering different pathways in Jewish spirituality. He's a very fascinating professor. He spoke here about 12 or 13 years ago. So some of you may remember, but I would encourage you to come. It will be a very, very interesting discussion. On Wednesday, we will continue with the study of the Kathopanishad. And on Tuesday and Saturday, our meditation will also continue as usual. Let's conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.